At the time Margaret Garner and her family crossed the frozen Ohio River in search of freedom, slavery dominated national political conversations. Abolitionists living in the northern states clashed with ardently pro-slavery Southerners, and at times faced violence from their fellow Northerners. Fierce and at times bloody contestations over slavery played out in the chambers of Congress. But it had not always been so. During the colonial period, before the American colonies declared their independence from Britain, African slavery had existed in all 13 colonies. People of African descent labored without compensation for enslavers whose rights to control and exploit their bodies were nearly absolute. The status of slave was passed down from mother to child, with each child born to an enslaved mother themselves inheriting a lifetime of servitude and legal status as property. By the time the colonies declared their independence on July 4, 1776, roughly 1 out of every 5 people living in British North America was enslaved. By the late 18th century, however, slavery had started to become an increasingly sectional institution. The architects of colonial independence had espoused Enlightenment principles of inherent human equality and liberty. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Many Americans regarded slavery as standing in obvious contradiction to these principles, as well as to the prevailing religious doctrines that specified that all human beings were spiritually equal and created in God's image. In the last decades of the 18th century, many northern states, whose economies were less dependent on slavery than the cash crop economies of the South, moved to abolish slavery, often for moral reasons. The southern states, on the other hand, clung to the institution, which expanded rapidly with the rise of cotton cultivation in the early 19th century. Women and men with the legal status of Margaret Garner would produce the cotton that northern women like Maria Cornell spun into yarn and wove into textiles. For a time, the free states in the North and the slave states in the South coexisted with each other in an uneasy political truce. By the 1830s, however, conflicts over the institution of slavery were slowly beginning to draw more sustained public and political attention. In the northern states, a small but vocal number of black and white activists began to insist that slavery was a sinful and unjust institution that had to be immediately eliminated. These activists, who called themselves abolitionists, were influenced by religious and moral commitments to human equality. Their fierce critiques of slavery and other hierarchies, including the legal and social limitations placed on women, marked them as radicals whose message was often met with hostility even from other Northerners. But factions of Northern politicians who themselves shared a distaste for slavery began to attempt to limit the institution's spread into territories and states in the West. While most of these politicians acknowledged that slavery could not legally be eliminated where it already existed, they wanted to reserve any new territories acquired by the United States exclusively for free labor. Political battles over the potential expansion of slavery became explosively contentious in 1848, after a U.S. victory in a 2-year war with Mexico resulted in the U.S. acquisition of a huge swath of land in the West. Even as that new land brought with it the possibility that U.S. settlement would extend all the way to the Pacific coast, it also brought with it intense conflict over whether slavery would be legal in the territories created from Mexican cession land. Southern Democrats desperately wanted the answer to be yes. Many Northern politicians insisted that the territory where slavery had not been permitted under Mexican law remain free. Congress's bitter inability to reach consensus on this point led to heated political debates and even threats of Southern secession. Fearing the potential dissolution of the Union, politicians reached a compromise. Whether the Mexican cession territories allowed slavery or not would be up to their residents to decide via elections. As a conciliation to get representatives from the slave states to agree to this plan, Congress passed a new Fugitive Slave Act. This act, which would come to be at the center of Margaret Garner's legal trials, expedited the legal processes through which people accused of being fugitives from slavery could be returned to the southern states. It also required Northern officials to cooperate with the capture and return of alleged fugitives or face stiff fines and penalties, and it made it a crime for residents of Northern states to assist slaves in freeing or to interfere with the capture of alleged fugitive slaves. The passage of a new Fugitive Slave Act as part of the Compromise of 1850 helped to prevent the immediate dissolution of the Union, but it did nothing to ameliorate lingering social and political tensions over slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act was tremendously controversial with residents of free states, some of whom argued that it violated their religious conscience and the right of their states to refuse to participate in the institution of slavery. In some parts of the North, slave catchers' attempts to recapture alleged fugitives were met with resistance from mobs of black and white anti-slavery activists. Posters in Boston warned black residents to beware of kidnappers in their midst. Northern writers, including Harriet Beecher Stowe, decried the act as inhumane and unjust. Meanwhile, in Congress, new conflicts over slavery had emerged by 1854 as officials attempted to organize the Kansas and Nebraska territories in preparation for the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. According to a compromise that had been reached over 30 years earlier, the Kansas Territory sat north of the line that separated slave territory from free. However, Southern Democrats refused to concede that Kansas should be free. The conflict between them and Northern politicians was resolved by the passage of an act called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which again left the question of slavery up to voters in a policy known as popular sovereignty. Northern anger over this compromise led to the formation of a new political party, one whose platform was devoted to preventing the expansion of slavery into new territories. This new party was called the Republican Party, and it enjoyed a rapid rise to political popularity in the North. Salmon P. Chase, an ardent opponent of slavery and critic of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, would be an early member of the party. Chase was elected the first Republican governor of Ohio and sworn in on January 14, 1856. 2 weeks later, Margaret Garner would be arrested in Cincinnati for the murder of her child. To what extent was the public sensation surrounding Garner's case a product of the times? How did ongoing conflicts over the institution of slavery shape the way people saw and understood her actions?